All right,
Okay.
we are group 2. And we are going to have 2 questions to discuss. First question, a female student, I'll minimize this for a second. A female student reported that she was being sexually harassed by a male student. As the male student enters your office carrying his bag, you notice a strange scent coming from the bag, which you believe is marijuana. We will discuss how we would handle the sexual harassment and the drug infraction.
All right. I think like the main thing that I thought about when I was reading this was like the first statement when it talked about that there was a student being sexually harassed. In our book, it told us, or it talked about that any form of like sexual harassment or sexual discrimination has to be investigated by an administrator. So I think that, I mean, first of all, you need to just make sure that you take that very seriously and you are investigating that, because the Supreme Court did rule that public schools can be sued for failing to deal with students that harass their classmates. So I think it's important that you make sure that you are investigating that thoroughly.
And I think with that, you should have some school policies that you can follow along with too. You should have a school policy on sexual harassment. So make sure you're following what your district's guidelines are.
Right, and that policy should include, so the way I look at this is the sexual harassment is definitely like issue number 1. This male student with his marijuana smell is going to be issue number 2, because if someone's being sexually harassed, they're actually being hurt by someone else. If somebody is maybe doing marijuana, then they're only really hurting themselves. So you would definitely deal with the sexual harassment first. And so that policy that Brooklyn's talking about, I think definitely it would have to get documented. So you would want to talk to the female student alone first, either have her document it or help her through that documentation of what she's experienced, and then take that document directly to a Title IX officer within your school, whoever the Title IX officer has been assigned.
I think to kind of piggyback off that, so it talks about like procedural due process. You know, you do need to investigate that, and like Bridget said, you know, you need to document, you know, what the girl, like, you know, what the girl went through and everything like that. It is important to know that, like, when we are talking about procedural due process, that there has to be a prescribed set of steps that are followed. You know, it allows students and school personnel, you know, an opportunity to protect themselves from allegations as well. So if, you know, there is an allegation of sexual harassment against that student, they also have to make sure that they go through, you know, procedural due process to make sure that he is also having a right to defend himself before they, you know, they just automatically, you know, have consequences, or, you know, he's suspended or whatever the situation is. He does need to be able to protect himself and you know, state his side of the story, whatever that is. But I do agree with Bridget by saying, you know, you do need to document that stuff and make sure that what happened to her is being heard.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I also think
both of them.
Right. So I would deal with her first, and
Yeah.
a sexual harassment thing might be very uncomfortable. So if she's, you know, if one of the 3 of us is the principal, she might not feel comfortable talking to one of the 3 of us, because it could be intimidating to maybe talk to that principal, depending on the relationships the principal has with the students. I think you could always maybe refer that student in a sexual harassment situation maybe to a guidance counselor or a school psychologist to do that documentation step. So it might not be, I mean, the principal could certainly do it if the student was comfortable, but I think the principal could also offer that they could tell their report to someone they would be comfortable telling it to.
Yep, I agree.
And then follow up to make sure that it did get done.
I agree with that.
Okay, and then anything else on this male student then with his backpack? or his book bag. We have a section in our book about book bags.
I mean, I think that it's important that, I mean, if you do have reasonable suspicion that he is, you know, he does have marijuana on himself or in his book bag, you do have to remember that they do have rights still. Student does still have rights. But going along with that, if there is this reasonable suspicion that he has that in his backpack, with my understanding, it is that you are able to search, you know, search his backpack, whether that be with, you know, a police officer there, if you have that in your school, or yourself as the administrator.
It was my understanding too that they could search because it is an illegal substance. So it could be a harm to the student or to another student, even though it's just in his backpack.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's kind of the key thing, is that it could be a harm to himself or another student too.
Yeah.
So it gives you, you know, the right to kind of search him to protect himself or other students as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think if it was me in the situation, I don't know. I asked my superintendent this exact situation question, and he's definitely said to deal with the sexual harassment issue first.
Yeah.
He said he would completely ignore the marijuana thing, because he said you gotta deal with the most important thing first, which is obviously this female student. And he
Yeah.
said, and this one particular day, because the male student just happened to come in, he said he would completely ignore the marijuana thing to begin with, and just deal
And
with
I
the
agree
sexual
with that.
harassment issue.
With this scenario, I
Yeah.
agree with that too. If it was just completely separate instances, then I think you could do a search on the book bag. You know what I mean?
Right. And I think my principal, I asked about like locker searches and that kind of thing. And she said they actually did that this fall. And I was completely unaware of it, but they brought in canine dogs and they were smelling lockers, and they identified like 6 lockers or something. And so she said the police came with the dogs, but then the police had to completely leave the hallway. When the principal opened those lockers, or in this case, a book bag, the principal can look in the locker and look in the book bag, but the officer cannot without a search warrant. So principal could maybe deal with the marijuana, but she would not, an officer would not be allowed to search his bag without a warrant. Okay, anything else on this one?
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, when you were talking about the canines, there is a court case, I think it was like, I think it's Doe versus Renfro. It did say that the officials, like the school officials, they did act within their, you know, within their right to use the dogs to seek out drugs. So I think, as far as I know, it is, you know, within the school's rights to do that, as long as, you know, they have reasonable suspicion or anything like that. So,
Right, and then our book uses the words of sufficient justification. So as long as that principal is justified and being reasonable with what they're doing, the court will support it.
Yep.
Okay, are we good on this one? All right, so then we had 2 in our group. So our next one was, whoops. Sorry about that, let me go back. There we go.
so this one just kind of talked about, said, as the school, as the principal of the school district, you determine that it is necessary to use breathalyzer on all students as they enter prom. So it's just kind of asking us to discuss the procedures you would take to perform this legally.
So I think the
Okay.
first thing is like the event at hand is prom. So prom we know is voluntary. So if it is voluntary, you can use breathalyzers at an event.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, one of the key things, is that it's voluntary. So students aren't required to be there. And it's, it's an outside school, well, it's an outside event. That's, I mean, it is school sponsored, but, so they can breathalyzer these students. But I think another thing that's important to understand is that it has to be done by, somebody that is qualified, such as, a police officer or a qualified like school official that's been trained in administering breathalyzer tests. So.
And I think long before prom, the procedure first would be, before you even get close to the night of, would be to send out something to all the parents so that parents and families and students all knew what the procedure was going to be. So it wasn't like a surprise or a catch ya kind of a thing. As long as, in the selling of prom tickets or just whatever, if you post something on the website about prom upcoming, here's the protocol for how prom is going to go. As long as everybody has been given the information ahead of time, they know what's coming and it's not a catch ya situation.
Yeah, and I think too, if the district like plans to use breathalyzer testing for some of those events, they probably have a policy in place too that specifically states that. But I don't think it would hurt to review that and give that heads up, like, hey, this is going to happen that night.
Yeah, our book kind of talks about that too. It says like, it's really important that you have those procedures in place well ahead of time, so that parents know that this can happen and that this is an option. And then like Brooklyn said, sending that to parents and kind of reminding them by saying, hey, this is something that we can do, because you don't want them to be kind of caught off guard either, even though it is well in the rights of schools to be able to breathalyzer students, which I don't think is like an uncommon thing. I mean, I know every prom that I ever went to, or any dance or anything that I went to, we in high school and stuff, we always had breathalyzers that we had to blow into. So I don't think this is really an uncommon.
Really? I've never experienced that. I've never done a breathalyzer
Maybe
test
it's the different size of school.
Yeah, I think that's another thing too, is the size of school. Like I said, earlier I went in, I went to a bigger district, so we always had liaisons and stuff like that. So every dance that I went to, from my freshman year to my senior year, you had to blow into a breathalyzer no matter what.
Yep, same here, but
every student.
Class A school, so maybe it's just different because much larger.
Well, my Class D schools that I work in or have worked in, I know last year at prom I was teaching in a different school, but I went actually to prom last year for the first time, even though I'd been there for several years, but just really didn't have a reason to go. I was more of a middle school teacher. So, but last year I went, and their policy or the procedure was there were no breathalyzers at all, but they had it off of school grounds. It was in like a dance hall in a small nearby town. And their policy was they had dinner, and then they cleared dinner and then turned the same place into the dance hall. And at that point, when it went from dinner to dance, I think it was, they searched their bags, because they were also, it was like a all night thing. And at that point, all the parents were leaving. So once all the parents were gone, the principals took it upon themselves to search bags for bottles, was more of the thing. So everybody opened their bag and was like, yep, here you go. Because they all knew that was, they'd done it every year, and that's just what they did.
I think another thing to kind of talk about too is if there is a student, if you aren't testing every student, you're not breathalyzing every student. If there is a student that you do have some sort of suspicion about, you need to have like solid ground to be able to back up your suspicions. And then on top of that, you also have to bring in, you would probably have to bring in like a police officer or something like that to do that search, because of the fact that you're not breathalyzing every student.
Because then it could be discrimination of some kind.
Yeah, so you have to have, legitimate, reasonable, you know, suspicion to test this kid. It can't just be, you know, oh, this kid might have been drinking or something. You're not testing every kid, so it's not in your policy or anything like that. So you have to have a legitimate reason why you want to test them or breathalyze them.
Yeah, I think it said like an immediate concern that they would be a risk to themselves or others.
Obviously, you know, at school dances, kids are driving.
Yep.
So I think that's one of the main reasons that if a student, you know, if they do feel that a student is under the influence of something, that is, you know, one of the concerns.
Right. And I thought that this question was written well because it does say all students. So that does give up a little bit of that burden of picking people and just doing it to everybody.
Yeah.
Final thoughts? Anything else? All right. That is the wrap up of our discussion.